will be really cool. So, first of all, we're going to start off the day with how to structure a deal. So led by my colleague in arms, Andy Iron, will be talking through. Andy, do you want to give an overview as to what we're going to cover in that section?
Yeah, sure. We're going to be covering the transaction economics. So we're going to talk a lot about valuations, dilutions, cap tables, all this good stuff. So a lot of fun to have there. So wake you up and get you involved in this session. And again, we welcome all of your questions, of course, throughout.
And then we're going to move on in from there, from structuring a deal. So at the end of Andy's talk, we'll bring in King and Spalding to talk about the actual process of making a deal happen, which is really cool. Then we're going to go into how to conduct DD. So, you know, due diligence on average, I think the average investor spends 20 hours of due diligence. So it's not going to be a 20-hour session. There will be breaks between each of these modules as well, by the way. It'll be more of just chatting through, breaking down the areas of due diligence into kind of 4 or 5 key areas, and then talking about some of the things you could be looking into to get a feel for, to just try and make sure that there's nothing nasty, no skeletons in the closet waiting in there. So we're going to have a look through there. We're then going to move on, as you know, we've mentioned about, you know, previously about as an investor, the brand that Andy's talked through an awful lot, your investment thesis as well. And we're going to, part of your brand and part of your thesis should be, how can you add value to a deal? And so we're going to talk a lot more about post-investment support. So, you know, once you've made the investment, you've written the check, you've written it off in your head, as Andy's mentioned, you know, what we're going to talk a little bit about, what sort of things you can do to help support the founder, and probably touch a little bit about what you can expect from the founder moving forward as well, from contact as well. We'll touch onto that a little bit as well. And then finally, we're going to end the 2-day marathon educational workshop with how to form an angel group. So I mentioned, for those of you who've just joined us and weren't involved for the beginning part of the session, we do quite a lot of work at UKBA in forming angel groups. So we have about 80+ angel group members across the UK, deploying quite a lot of money every year. And so I'm going to share some of the kind of commercial models, some of the structures, the do's, the don'ts, the positives, the highs and lows of running and organizing an angel group, because we think they are a very effective way to grow, build and scale early stage angel investing. And indeed, we're going to start to, such as our industry move forward, there will be some level of kind of amalgamation coming together as angel groups form and merge, and we've started to see that already. So it's not as fragmented, but the starting point is running lots of great groups based around kind of agreed, like-minded principles and an ethos. So we're going to talk through that as well at the end. And then finally, we'll have a bit of a wash up and final thoughts from Andy and I, where we'll talk about the world in general and our kind of our thoughts for the session as well, won't we, Andy?
Of course we will. Thank you, Rod. So before I dive into it, actually, firstly, I noticed a lot of engagement and questions and conversations yesterday in the chat, especially during the pitch session at the end. You know, you wasn't as impressed as I was with Rod's magic with the logos, but I could see that you were really interested in all of the pitches, and you had a lot of different varied opinions about the pitches. So again, even if you haven't got questions, if you just have thoughts that are going through your head, things that you're seeing on screen that you want to understand, just put it into the chat and let's have conversations through seeing what's in the chat, because the more contextual that we can make this, the more you're going to get value from this time together. Okay, so please, 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 as Roz just put in the chat, feel free to just have the conversations and put things into the chat. Okay, so the first thing I always say with like transaction economics and structuring deals is that investing is really actually mostly about the psychology of money and your personal behaviors based on your risk appetite. And that's very personal, right? Everyone's got a different risk appetite. Some people have families, some people don't. Some people have a mortgage to pay for, some people don't. So everyone's got a different risk profile and appetite to the risks that they can take. However, there are some fundamental transaction economics, regardless of where you sit on the spectrum, right? And this is all about understanding the risk and return of the investments that you're going to make. They're not going to be complex, but they are important to understand and to know when you're doing deals, okay? So these are the kind of 6 areas that we're going to cover off within this section. The first is going to be around valuations and really understanding how do you determine the value, as someone asked yesterday, that a company is worth. The second is really around cap tables. So that's really an illustration of who owns equity within the company and who's planning to invest in the company and what's the equity going to look like once they do. And we're going to break down and explain exactly what's going on in that cap table. And it's part of your digital pack. You've got a copy of this cap table for you to manipulate, play around with, get bored with in 5 minutes. But at least you've got a cap table now going forward that you can play with. A lot of the times, actually, the founders will provide you with their cap tables. And then actually that's how you can get a view of who's invested already and who's invested in this round.
It's definitely handy to help familiarize yourself with cap tables and how they work and different percentages, etc. as well. So it's a super handy tool. I think just to mention, just to kind of back, there's a few other mentions of bits in your goodie bag coming up as well. It will be sent as a link to download either from me or more likely from Monshad. So you'll hear from them as and when it comes. So we'll organize that at the end. And I do believe there is a certificate of completion that you will receive if you can successfully completed the 2 sections. So that's
make it to the end. So make it to the end.
Make it to the end to survive it. I think Andy, you and I get a certificate of completion as well, which is nice.
All right, thank you, Rod. So going through this section, we're also going to touch on returns and the fact that actually so many businesses fail. Why is that? And actually, how do you make your money given the fact that there's such a high failure rate? We've touched a lot on that actually yesterday, but we're just going to reinforce it again today. Dilution, what that means and why it's so important, and the different strategies that investors take depending on whether they're investing on winners or in down rounds, which is very complicated and I wouldn't advise, but I'll touch on that when I get to it. Financial modeling, like how valuable is that at this early stage? What modeling can you assess, can you do at this early stage? And then finally, investment memos, which we touched on a little bit yesterday, but we're going to explain exactly what they are and why you use them.
It says it's owned by. Does it have the appropriate, licenses, right? And then what we do is we obviously have the warranties, which help us, which are statements of fact, right, in relation to the business. So we really take a commercial view when it comes to that. So we're not going to town on due diligence in the pre-seed or seed round. Definitely not the approach at all. As far as fees are concerned, the fees are reflective of the fact that the due diligence is very high level and big ticket, right? So it's definitely not charged at the same rate as it is in a Series A or Series B. We tend to find that in the seed and the pre-seed rounds, the investor swallows the cost of the due diligence in terms of the investment. However, we do also find that some investors essentially pass the cost on to the company. And it's something that companies need to be increasingly sort of aware of and just get comfortable with, which is the fact that, as investors come in and the rounds get later and later, the company will be expected to bear the legal fees of that investment, and the legal fees will be subtracted from the investment amount. So I think the key thing there is just making sure that the cap on the legal fees is in place, and the lawyers are giving you good value for money. So
awesome, thank you very much, Mackie. So that kind of concludes, and it's always going to be the biggest section of our 5 key areas. The next 4 areas I'm going to cover in people, financial, commercial, and technical won't be as in-depth as that bit. Mackie, are you able to hang around for the last bit of this section so you can add in some your insights that you see around some of the DD and in people, financial, commercial, technical? That'd be really helpful. Amazing. So I appreciate that. Cool. I'll put Mackie's email in the chat as well, so do feel free to reach out to him for anything else. And to the founder asking about that checklist, there's a checklist that's part of the goodie bag, so you can use that. I recommend building up what's called a data room. So this is Dropbox, anything. You can use Dropbox, you can use OneDrive, you can use Box that Andy's mentioned, you can use Google Docs, but a dedicated, nicely labeled, nicely folded due diligence, I guess it's called data room, where investors can access it and go through just to make things fast, easy, simple for the investors and improve that time flow from interest to investment. So recommend that. So let's move on to people now. It's one of the 5 key areas for comprehensive due diligence, and he's going to be jumping in on this one. I can see he's rubbing his hands with glee and this is to risk. And point number 1, and we've covered some of this already, in fact, as we've gone through, so hence it will speed up the section. It's about following your money. So this is a key strategy to make sure, and we have referenced it, about following your money, because if you don't, it sends off a bad signal. That founder also is about being realistic. We've said the founder will need multiple funding rounds moving forward to grow their business. And so if you just make that first investment and lead them to it, they could go bust, not enough money. So following your money is an important factor, but obviously without throwing good money after bad as well. So we've covered that already a little bit. So that's sped this section up. We are going to finish a little bit earlier. That sounds good. Another big point here, and Andy's touched on this, is about from an investment perspective, is to use your network. I mean, you would have built up a network of other investors, other wealthy individuals, people in different industries, potential suppliers and supporters. This is something that angels can really bring to the table to help a founder, is by opening up your black book of contacts and introducing them. In fact, one of the biggest things that you can do is to bring in other investors.
Absolutely.
A funding round, and that's the biggest. And Andy's already mentioned it a couple of times, that it's the money that is the most value.
Yeah, that ties all of them together, actually. Like, the more customers that you can introduce, or suppliers and partners, ultimately that's building up their money and therefore their runway. So
it helps
the aim of the game.
Important. And it's you might be in business for 30, 40, 50 years, who knows? And in that time, you built up some really interesting, helpful people that could help out a startup as they grow and as they move up the food chain, which leads me on to helping them along the finance chain. So what does this actually look like? Now, this is more of a complicated one, but it is important. So I mentioned, like, I wonder if I can actually bring up a slide from yesterday without it taking me 2 days. Let me have a quick look if I can do that. Yeah, I can actually. Here we go. Obviously, just without it taking me too long. So where's the one about? So let's have a look. Sorry. This is why I shouldn't be in charge of the technology here. Here we go. Cool. So helping them along the finance food chain, the finance value chain is what I mean. Now, what do I mean by this is, as a company grows and builds, and I mentioned at the beginning, you're investing around here kind of time, and you'll be investing again here, maybe again here before they hit break even. And now it's time for the VCs. Sorry, the writing's terrible because I'm doing it from a mouse. Which
it's legible. It's legible.
It's legible. Thank you, Andy. Appreciate that. So these are the next stage of investors, and what you don't want from a founder's perspective is for them to be raising their funding round here, raising it there, great, and now they need their institutional round. They're tracking really well, and it's time to get that big chunky fund. Where's that going to come to? That founder, the CEO, often is in charge of fundraising. Obviously, it's their job to get out there, meet, greet, pound the pavement, but actually from an investor's perspective, it's well within your capabilities to start building your own network and relationships up with other investors. So starting to get to know these, and it touches into Andy's point about the brand and building brand awareness and relationships around the investment community. If you build up multiple investors in your network here, these little dots down here, that's exciting, in your little network here, you can help galvanize them to put money into that third round, and that's helping your investor, that's helping your business. So you can help the founder along those different funding rounds by building up your relationships. And I can tell you this now, it is one thing from a founder to go to investor, hey, Mrs. Investor, I need some money, please, to an investor saying, hey, Mrs. Investor, I've put some money into this and you might like it too. That's a very different approach and a very different conversation to the founder.
It's a very strong referral.
Really strong referral. And it coming from another investor makes them much more likely to open it and engage with it, especially someone who's put their own skin in the game and put their own money into it.
Yeah, you can also start building relationships with other investors that way, so that they can bring you into future deals. You can bring them into future deals, and then slowly you start getting a network of investors that you're actually working with.
Yeah, absolutely, and vice versa. It's really important. But then also, once it starts to go beyond the angel piece and into the VC world, nothing to stop you building up relationships with the VC community to understand what they're doing. Especially if you're being specific in a sector or a horizontal around maybe AI or IoT or 5G or healthcare, you can start to build relationships in there. And if you're able to get a bit of a brand going and you're a good investor and you can build up some good relationships, then you'll get to know, and the VCs would want to know you as well. Why I mentioned about how angel groups are forming VCs, VCs are forming angel groups, and the rise of what's called the venture partner. The venture partner doesn't get paid anything generally. They might get some options or a bit of share or a little tickle here, but they generally don't get anything. So why would an angel want to act as a venture partner for a VC for free? Well, it's because that VC brings firepower. They bring financial firepower and clout and resources and support. And by having that close working relationship, it's really tactical. My companies in my portfolio, I can help get them access to VC investment much far easier by having these relationships. So it's why it's important for you as investors to help nurture that and build that relationship and help the company through.
Yeah, and sometimes those relationships, they're also known as scouts, and they have a finder's fee attached to them. So, you know, they can say up to 5% up to a certain level of investment, or let's say £5,000 fee. And then that scout has the option to either take that in equity as part of that VC's, I guess, single round, or to take it in payment themselves.
That's clear in the messy drawings. So the next thing is about advise and to guide. In fact, this section was meant to take a solid 40 minutes, but we're rattling through it because we covered so much of it already. So advise and guide, and give this guidance to founders already. Now, there's a few things in here that we've mentioned already. You don't necessarily need to sit on the board to give this guidance. We've mentioned about the criminal and fiduciary duties of sitting on a board in a company that could be challenging, but actually it's just about sharing any experience that you have and talking to the founder, and sometimes acting as a soundboard. Now, a soundboard is, you know, there to listen and to give your own thoughts and beliefs in things, and help them along what is going to be a difficult journey. You know, it is a mountainous journey, being a founder, and actually point them in the right direction to maybe avoid some of those mountains. You know, it's pointing it down the valley, avoid the mountains, is something that you can do as an investor, because maybe not all of you, but someone in your syndicate or in your friendship group may have actually started the company, grown it, sold it, been in a similar situation, and can share that knowledge and that guidance as well to founders. And it can be super helpful. If you have an investor who has been through exits, they are really helpful to helping a startup to get into that exit mindset from the beginning, from the get-go, to understand what it is, what kind of growth is going to be expected of them, and what kind of milestones are going to be the most realistic for them to start to become attractive for potential acquirers. What sort of structure does work? And if you have those talents, that insight, those skills, give it to your startup founders. I don't see why you wouldn't. At the same time, if you don't have those, don't force it at them either. You have to respect the fact that the founder, you know, the reason, remember, why did you invest in them in the first place? And it was because you liked the founder, you believed in them, and you felt they had a really good chance of having a good crack at deploying their business plan and making it work. And so trusting that gut instinct is important, and giving the founder a bit of space to make mistakes and to do things can be helpful as well. We do hear stories of investors who constantly demanding information, constantly getting frustrated with the founder, really not giving them that chance. And actually, when you look at the investor's background, they're in no better position as well, to be quite honest. You know, if you don't think you can add a huge amount of value, don't push it on the founder. Be passive, sit in the back seat, and trying to find other people that can help them as well. So advise and guide if you think you can add value. If you're not so sure, then don't. You know, let them make the mistakes, and it might be one of your 6 in 10 that go bust. C'est la vie. That is the way life works. So that's what happens, and take that and move on and learn from that. Anything you want to add around that as well, Andy? Some of the key areas?
No, I think one of the key things as well is just being available and responsive. Like, it's so founders really appreciate it when they feel like, you know what, I could give this investor a call or a Telegram message, like, or there's something I just want to talk about that might be related to family and not necessarily work. Like, I know that I could just have that conversation with these investors. So not every single conversation is transactional or commercial. And it's just important to understand that they're humans too. They're going through the ebbs and flows of life too. They're experiencing COVID too. So just bear that in mind as well. And maybe that's an area where you're not as comfortable, but bear in mind they might need to turn to someone for that. There may be someone else on the cap table.
We've got a point in here from Moses. Startup management sometimes need leadership support from investors. Is there a way to do so without interfering with day-to-day operations and not being on the board? I'm going to get into that. Yes, absolutely. Having a committee or other name to help the company. Yeah, it's called an advisory board, Moses. It's a really good point. So often founders, and I encourage founders to do this because it's free and it's easy, is to put together an advisory board, which is nothing more than just a loose grouping of helpful individuals who can give them advice and guidance. There's no shareholding, there's no pay. They're just there to help and guide. They might also be investors as well. And in fact, if a founder has a great looking advisory board, I always ask, have any of them invested? And if they haven't, why not? So bear that in mind. But investors can absolutely an advisory board, and a founder who's worth their salt would be crazy not to take up on guidance and insight from experienced people who have been there and done it in the past. So if the founder doesn't want it, it's their loss if you've got that advice and guidance to give. So yeah, really good point there, Mosen. Sitting on a nice little light touch advisory board and you'll be the other thing as a founder will use you as well, because they'll put you on their deck. Our management team and our advisory board, and they'll say how great their investors are. And in fact, talking about how great their investors are is a really good accolade and something can really help bring in other investors.